PR wing for the FBI and the central command of the military. I suppose you could say that we are becoming a Ukrainian-style democracy in this country. But it's extremely dangerous. And as people who have been following me may know, I've participated in a number of conferences of the International Schiller Institute, which was founded by the widow of Lyndon LaRouche, Helga Zepp LaRouche, back in 1984, or was it 85?
It was 84.
In 1984, to try and create an alliance on the West based on the best of our culture. That is not British colonialism and imperialism, but in the case of the case of Germany, Beethoven, Schiller, Humboldt, the best that German classical tradition offered, and from the United States, our cultural intervention, and people don't normally think of politics as culture, but our cultural intervention, which was the American Revolution based on noble universal principles, on the dignity of man, the fact that every single human being is born equally endowed with the potential to become a genius in the image of the Creator. That's what's enshrined in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. But unfortunately, our nation seems to have been hijacked for the time being by the British Empire. We have come to embody exactly those things which we fought the American Revolution against. So just in terms of an update, there is a document from the Schiller Institute, and I'll post the link later here under the show on YouTube and on Facebook, where we are urging all religious leaders, particularly members of the Catholic Church, who have not been informed that the Pope has offered to be a mediator between Ukraine and Russia with no preconditions. And he also actually did something very unusual. He issued an apology for saying derogatory things about some of the Russian soldiers based on their ethnicity, saying that this was a mistake, that every person is equal and equally worthy of the same respect. And Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, said this is exactly what is needed if we are going to end the war, is for people to be able to recognize and admit their mistakes. So most people are not even aware of this offer, and there are actually numerous offers by people who recognize the danger of this war spiraling out of control, since the stated objective of Biden is not for Ukraine to beat Russia, but it is to destroy Russia, and therefore they are prepared to let Ukraine be ground up into tiny little pieces with nobody left in order to achieve their aim. And that's what I found actually so disturbing about Zelensky's speech. What kind of president could claim to represent his people, lying, knowing that well over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died, that many more people are going to die this winter with no heat, no electricity, and in horrible combat, which most of them don't want to fight. People are being conscripted. Men between the ages of 18 and 60 were not allowed to leave the country. And he is doing this for the financial elites, the people funding most of the US Congress. So this whole spectacle was really disgusting. George Washington is turning over in his grave, but most Americans also don't know anything about him or any of the founding fathers, because that history is being suppressed. So what I thought we would do is take up a little bit of his farewell address, which was really written knowing that he was no longer going to be at the helm of our newly created republic, as a warning and to share lessons that he had learned from the American Revolution and the first 8 years of our republic to the American people. So I can just say something from the beginning, and then I think Chris some thoughts. Oh, and that's our dog Baxter, who has many things to say himself. So he says at the beginning, friends and fellow citizens, the period for a new election of a citizen, not king, not the noble class, there wasn't one, to administer the executive government of the United States being not far distant, and the time actually arrived when your thoughts must be employed in designating the person who is to be clothed with that important trust, it appears to me proper, especially as it may conduce to a more distinct expression of the public voice, that I should now apprise you of the resolution I have formed, to decline being considered among the number of those out of whom a choice is to be made. And then he talks about why he is writing this and his concerns, which I will get to in a second, but let me see what thoughts you have and what you want to say about this.
Well, as we'll see as this goes on, I mean, Diane's going to read a number of, I think, critical sections from this. People should definitely read this document, because this is the person who, I remember 2 years ago on Christmas Eve, we had the pleasure of doing Sarah for Senate campaign show on on the Battle of Trenton, which of course Washington led on Christmas Day. And so this amazing person, General George Washington, President George Washington, this citizen, as he put it, was there for the entire creation of this republic. And these are his reflections at the end of his administration. And it was a very, very difficult, particularly second administration. The first 4 years went fairly well, although there was already a brewing faction fight. Hamilton, who was his key trusted advisor, who of course was his aide de camp in the American Revolution, and who he trusted more than any other advisor in terms of his advice in terms of how to create this republic. And as we know, Hamilton wrote a series of papers on public credit, on the national bank, and then on the question of manufacturers, which did not get picked up by the Congress. Was actually his proposals on that were effectively defeated by Congress, because there had been a faction created against Hamiltonian economics and Hamiltonian principles. And so this occurred during the first administration, during the first Washington administration, but in general, Hamilton's policies won out. And Washington really, really listened to Hamilton and valued his ideas on the question of nation building, a national bank being one of the first and foremost things. So what happened was people think of the two parties, right? The Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. But actually, at this time, there were no parties. There were no parties. And that's how Washington wanted it. And he will, as you'll see, Diana's going to read sections from this, he's going to warn about this hideous problem of faction. So,
well, I just want to read a little bit more of the introduction, because you have a sense he really sees himself as the father of the republic. And that's what he's telling people his thoughts on maintaining this. And he says, if benefits have resulted to our country from these services, that is his services, what he has done, let it always be remembered to your praise and as an instructive example in our annals, that under circumstances in which the passions agitated in every direction, were liable to mislead amidst appearances sometimes dubious, vicissitudes of fortune often discouraging, in situations in which not unfrequently want of success has countenanced the spirit of criticism. The constancy of your support was the essential prop of the efforts and a guarantee of the plans by which they were effected. Profoundly penetrated with this idea, I shall carry it with me to my grave as a strong incitement to unceasing vows that heaven may continue to you the choicest tokens of its beneficence, that your union and brotherly affection may be perpetual, that the free constitution, which is the work of your hands, may be sacredly maintained, that its administration in every department may be stamped with wisdom and virtue, that in fine, the happiness of the people of these states, under the auspices of liberty, may be made complete by so careful a preservation and so prudent a use of this blessing as will acquire to them the glory of recommending it to the applause, the affection, and adoption of every nation which is yet a stranger to it. Here perhaps I ought to stop, but a solicitude for your welfare, which cannot but end with my life, and the apprehension of danger natural to that solicitude, urge me on an occasion like the present to offer to your solemn contemplation and to recommend to your frequent review some sentiments which are the result of much reflection and of no inconsiderable observation, and which appear to me as all important to the permanency of your felicity as a people. And this document, by the way, I believe was read in Philadelphia every year for many, many years, at least until the middle of the 1800s. Now, no one is familiar with it. Nobody studies it. It's not read anywhere. It's certainly not in the US Congress, or I don't know if they would be able to conduct themselves in such a horrific manner. You want to take that part?
Sure. He says the unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence. The support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively, though often covertly and insidiously, directed. It is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as of the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discountenancing what may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts. So this is really, really rich, right? I mean, first of all, this is before the Civil War, but he's already seeing a foreboding situation where the North and the South are being pitted against each other. And this is what Hamilton also really railed against. This idea, oh, the good old fashioned South with the slaves and the cotton and their way of life, and then that industrial North with cities and bustling places with industrious people, free men, that these were incompatible. Well, in one sense, a slave system is compatible with a free system, but the point was that the nation had to be kept together, and the principles for doing that and for creating a more perfect union were there in the Constitution. Now, the other thing that strikes me about this is that, I mean, he could be addressing this to every citizen of the United States, and is right now. This beautiful thing that he says about watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety. How many of us have jealous anxiety right now? I mean, anybody who's thinking about the way the Constitution is being shredded since 9/11, since the assassination of Kennedy, and it's interesting that that Mike Pompeo and these creeps are still covering up the role of the CIA in the assassination of Kennedy, and then after 9/11, the way that our freedoms were completely shredded. How many Americans are anguished with jealous anxiety about maintaining their nation? How many Americans are willing to just say, in any event, it can be abandoned? And this is what Washington tells you. This is what you have as a citizen in a republic. As a citizen, you are a citizen, like he's a citizen. It's a beautiful idea. He's a citizen. He's also the person who's most responsible for creating this republic. But fundamentally, he's a citizen like you. And these are the things that have preoccupied his conscience and his being in his every waking moment, and maybe non-waking moment. And this is what should be in your mind all the time as a citizen of a republic.
Just going back to what I read earlier, also, you heard that he hoped that we would be successful so that every other new nation or newly liberated nation could see us as a model for their own development. Not that we were going to bludgeon people into submitting, or everybody in every culture would want to be identical, but certain universal principles.
A city on a hill.
Right, exactly. And he goes on to say, I don't know if we can find it, but they talk about Baxter's agitated because there's big dogs outside too. That the government has to be strong enough to preserve the liberty. And this may shock some people who are listening, but I would say our government was weak and anemic because it has been taken over by financial interests, which are not representative of the people, of which we have no say over. I mean, the Federal Reserve, as people know, is a private bank, but think about our Congress. Our Congress is not a representative body. There are people who've been in there. I don't know, Schumer's been in there since the dinosaurs, for example, or others practically, and they serve financial interests. They don't feel the need to serve the people that they are supposed to represent. So Washington was clear in this document, you actually need a robust government to protect the freedom of the people from the usurpers. For whom do the intelligence agencies actually work? Is the Federal Bureau of Investigation safeguarding the rights and the well-being of the American people? No, they are not. How about the so-called Central Intelligence Agency? No, they're busy overthrowing governments all over the world and putting Nazis and terrorists in power,
including our own. They don't like who you voted for.
Exactly. So actually, we have to restore the government of the United States, not a cabal of elites. Now, going on to this party question, Washington first talks about geographical discriminations. the division of the Union. And remember, after the American Revolution, although there was Evacuation Day, what year was the first one?
83.
Was that the one in Boston? There was
Oh,
one in New
the
York.
first, well, Boston was when they left, that was in 76. I mean, that was when Knox organized all of the cannons
Yeah.
he pulled them all down from Ticonderoga in the middle of the winter, got them all the way down from Ticonderoga down from upstate New York, and then all the way across Massachusetts over the Berkshire Mountains, pulled by oxes in snow, and then got them up on Dorchester Heights in the middle of the night. Got them all up on Dorchester Heights in the middle of the night. And when the British woke up the next morning, there were all these cannons in Dorchester Heights that would have been able to shoot them, except there was a winter storm that came, and so they weren't actually able to. They weren't in a position to get the cannonballs off right at that minute. But the British packed up their bags and they left, and they pulled out, and they then moved down to New York, which is where the whole thing took off, with leading to the Battle of Trenton and everything. The series of defeats in New York City of the Americans. But then the second one, I guess the evacuation day was, I believe it was in 1783, after the actual peace of Paris was completed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But besides Evacuation Day, they didn't leave. The Brits had strongholds in Canada and the West and the South, and they had their agents inside the United States, people like Aaron Burr and others. Frankly, people like Andrew Jackson. I don't know how consciously he was, if he was pro-British, do you know? But his ideology was certainly British imperialist. So the idea was to destroy the Union, to destroy the Republic from within and without. And of course, that came to a head right after Lincoln became president with the so-called Civil War and the firing on Fort Sumter. But that's later. Let's get back to this. So Washington warns about parties divided by geographical discriminations, Northern and Southern, Atlantic and Western. He says, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interest and views. We have that now, people proposing that this state or that state should secede from the Union. No, we have to be a union based on universal principles, not British imperialist principles. He says, one of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of the other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. The inhabitants of our Western country have lately had a useful lesson on this head. They have seen in the negotiation by the executive and in the unanimous ratification by the Senate of the treaty with Spain, and in the universal satisfaction at that event throughout the United States, a decisive proof how unfounded were the suspicions propagated among them of a policy in the general government and in the Atlantic states unfriendly to their interest in regard to the Mississippi. And this is like right out of Shakespeare or Iago, right? You make up an enemy and you gossip and you say, did you know that so-and-so has it in for you? Or whenever so-and-so orders pepperoni pizza, what they actually, that is the code for burning down your house. And then you hear the person order pepperoni pizza and you say, oh, they're going to burn down my house. That's just typical British divide and conquer. It's a game to keep everybody divided. So you have a little enemy, in this case today, a handful of a few billionaires, a bunch of bankers who control $130 trillion. And their game is to get all of us to believe that we are each other's enemies, when actually all of us are in the same boat. We're on the brink of thermonuclear war. We're about to run out of energy and we're about to run out of food. So maybe we ought to work together to destroy these financial interests that are trying to pit us all against each other while we don't notice who is actually picking our pocket.
He says, the government, the offspring of our own choice, influenced and unawed, adopted upon full investigation and mature deliberation, completely free in its principles, in the distribution of its powers, uniting security with energy, and containing within itself a provision for its own amendment, has a just claim to your confidence and your support. Respect for its authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures, are duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty. The basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the constitution which at any time exists until changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people is sacredly obligatory upon all. The very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government.
That's really important.
It's very, very important, and it's especially important in a time like now, where you see corruption and injustice coming from the government that seems so outrageous. You see theft of elections, you see fraud left and right, and at the same time, you have to recognize that our constitutional republic, our constitutional government, has got to be protected at all costs. So the tendency will be to say, well, we can tear this government down. No, we are citizens in a republic. You can run for office. You can join our movement. We have got to create the conditions where this nation goes back to the constitutional principles that it was founded on. And tearing it down would only serve the interests of the British Empire's gang who want to destroy our country, who wanted to destroy it from the beginning. So I think that's really a critical point. And he says, now, let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief among some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and the duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. You have Washington warning you about the collapse of the republic and the constitutional principles, and what would come as a direct result of that, which would be despotism. Now, I want to just give you a sense of what has been going on in the period running up to this, because as many people know, France played a major role in the winning of our independence. Of course, Ben Franklin played a major role in France, organizing France. There were many people in France, like Lafayette, like Beaumarchais, who who understood why the United States, why the American Revolution had to be successful for all of mankind. They were Republicans with a small r. There were also people in France who saw the defeat of the British as in their interest, because the British and the French had been at war with each other forever, off and on. So it's important to think about that this. I'll give you an example. In 1793, this gentleman, Citizen Genet, came to the United States, and this was after the French Revolution. I mean, the French Revolution, we patriots in the United States would have hoped would have been a replica of the American Revolution, but instead, as we know, it turned into a bloodbath, and they killed their leading scientists like Lavoisier. They chopped their heads off, right? So this was not exactly an American Revolution. Now, you had a faction in the United States that was pro-French Revolution. That was Thomas Jefferson. That was Madison. That was even Monroe to a certain extent at that time. He then became horrified by it when he saw firsthand in France what was actually going on. But the point is that what Washington did was he declared a kind of neutrality, where he said, we want to have good relations with everyone, and we'll get to it. He talks about it in here. But this question of party was absolutely critical, because you had a faction in the United States which was being played by the French as well as the British. But this guy Genet came to the United States and allied himself with people like Freneau, who ran this newspaper that was attacking George Washington personally, and basically saying he was pro-British. He was pro-British, George Washington, because he didn't side with the French Revolution. And what a piece of sophistry that was, right? So these guys, they came over and they basically said, we're going to overthrow the Washington government. And they were working directly with Jefferson. And Washington became completely infuriated, because he realized that he had people in his own administration that were working directly against him and his policies, the policies of his administration. Now, one interesting thing was they basically they uncovered what this guy Genet was doing. And at the point at which he was going to be sent back to France, the French, being as fickle as they were, going from one government to the next, to the next, to the next, absolute chaos, they had already begun to send somebody over as ambassador from France to the United States. And they had recalled Genet, and they were going to put him on trial in France for crimes. And you know what Washington did? He said, no, I will not send Genet back to his death. And he actually protected Genet, and Genet ended up staying in the United States, saved his life. This is what Washington did. This guy who was basically trying to overthrow his government, he then turned around and protected this guy's life. Now that's principle. So it's but that was, you'll see in here what Washington gets at on this question of faction and on foreign nations trying to play the United States for their own interests. And we just saw some of that the other night with Zelensky's speech in front of the Congress. But of course, recognizing that, Zelensky is only a mouthpiece for the empire that's supporting him, and that's the British Empire, and they are masters at pitting all against all. So they don't want the United States working with Russia on economic development and cooperation. They are creating the conditions with their agents in the United States, directly as George Washington warns about in 1796, foreign powers playing their interests in the United States to destroy the United States and to break it apart.
Just a little more on party because it's so poetic. Washington writes, there's an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true, and in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of the popular character, that is, elected governments, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose, and there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be by force of public opinion to mitigate and assuage it. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. And you think of people's obsession with party today over the good of the nation and of the people as a whole. I don't want to be too long, but he also talks about the question of morality and religion. Washington says that it's very hard to have morality without religion. And he says, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizen. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in the courts of justice? It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Think about it. If the people have as much power as they have in our republic, what happens if the people become immoral? And of course, that was the ultimate way that the British, aided by the CIA, destroyed our nation, the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the MK Ultra, and the rock, drug, sex counterculture. What are you looking for?
There's a section in here where he's talking about that a question of morality and religion. Oh, and then promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. In proportion as the structure of government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened.
So you think about, obviously, when the public school system is as destroyed as it is, people want to homeschool, they want charter schools, they want school choice. You have to think about what you're saying. If the public school is not a place to send your children, then your nation is doomed, because it means that you're not going to have a citizenry that's capable of self-government. And that is why this question is extremely important, that there has to be a universal standard of education, not brainwashing, not multiple choice questions, but as Humboldt and others said, the development of character, of people who relive the discoveries of the greatest geniuses, people who are capable of actually thinking for themselves.
All right, so let's get to the, this is what as somebody, I listened to this speech. You can find them on YouTube, and people are reading the speech. And one of the comments underneath it is that this speech should be played quietly 24/7 in the halls of the U.S. Congress. Now, listen
And
to this.
someone has kindly shared the written copy of the speech in the links on Facebook.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Okay, on foreign policy, observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct, and can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period a great nation, to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Who can doubt that in the course of time and things, the fruits of such a plan would richly repay any temporary advantages which might be lost by a steady adherence to it? Can it be that Providence has not connected its permanent felicity of a nation with its virtue? The experiment, at least, is recommended by every sentiment which ennobles human nature. Alas, it is rendered impossible by its vices. So think about this, that the principle of good and justice towards all nations, is that what the United States has been doing since the death of John F. Kennedy? The exact opposite. The exact opposite. Our foreign policy has been a horror show.
Since the death of FDR, really.
Yeah, sure, right. Because Kennedy bucked it. He tried to do good again, and was killed by the Dulles brothers and others, these pigs, who had the exact opposite outlook of this. Right? We're going to run the world. We're going to dominate. We're going to crush everybody else. That's how we'll run the world. We're going to make sure that nobody else is strong. We're the only ones that will be strong. Russia's strong. We'll destroy Russia. We'll run coups around Russia's borders. We'll coup every government that's pro-Russian. And then finally, the coup de grace will overthrow Putin. And we'll break Russia up into little bits and pieces. We'll smash them.
Which all have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's insane, but it's also evil. It's the exact opposite of what our founding president, who we all claim to love, had in mind. And who can doubt that in the course of time and things, the fruits of such a plan of treating all nations with justice and good faith to cultivate peace and harmony, the fruits of such a plan would richly repay any temporary advantages which might be lost by a steady adherence to it. The temporary advantage of destroying another country, of running a color revolution somewhere, right? So this is really something that the American people and our representatives should read and study and take into your hearts. In the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded, and that in place of them, just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges towards another an habitual hatred, we hate Russia.
We hate China.
We hate China. Right? Why? Because we do. We hate them. And we love Ukraine. We love Ukraine. We will do whatever we can for Ukraine to defeat Russia because we hate Russia. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. And George Washington warned us about it. The nation which indulges towards another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave, And that's what you saw in Congress the other night. A Congress packed full of slaves. And there are representatives. And it's up to you to change the situation, you, the American people. We're a republic. You're a citizen like George Washington. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. Antipathy in the one nation against another disposes each more readily to offer insult and injury, to lay hold of slight causes of umbrage, and to be haughty and intractable when accidental or trifling occasions of dispute occur. Hence frequent collisions, obstinate, envenomed, and bloody contests. The nation, prompted by ill will and resentment, sometimes impels to war the government contrary to its best calculations of policy. I mean, this is amazing, right? This is exactly where we find ourselves. And Washington warned about us in 1796.
So we don't want to be too long on this eve of Christmas Eve, but so we'll just read a couple sections and wrap up. Is that all right?
Sure.
All righty. But it's very beautiful. And then Washington's farewell address, and someone from Minnesota, Derek Neeland, thank you, posted a link to this on Facebook, and maybe someone can do the same thing on the YouTube channel. So again, on foreign affairs, Washington writes, harmony, liberal intercourse with all nations are recommended by policy, humanity, and interest. But even our commercial policy should hold an equal and impartial hand, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences, consulting the natural course of things, diffusing and diversifying by gentle means the streams of commerce, but forcing nothing.
Sounds like he's against sanctions.
Yes, that's just what I was thinking. Nothing by force. It's all free will and encouragement, but not punishment. Establishing with power so disposed in order to give to trade a stable course, to define the rights of our merchants, and to enable the government to support them. Conventional rules of intercourse, the best that present circumstances and mutual opinion will permit, but temporary and liable from time to time, abandoned or varied as experience and circumstances shall dictate, constantly keeping in view that it is folly in one nation to look for disinterested favors from another, that it must pay with a portion of its independence for whatever it may accept under that character, that by such acceptance it may place itself in the condition of having given equivalents for nominal favors, and yet of being reproached with ingratitude for not giving more. There can be no greater error than to expect or calculate upon real favors from nation to nation. It is an illusion which experience must cure, which a just pride ought to discard. And so he goes on. I'm just looking to see. Yes. So Washington, and he's very humble. I mean, he was a genius himself. He writes, though in reviewing the incidents of my administration, I am unconscious of intentional error, I am nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. Whatever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. I also shall carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. relying on its kindness in this as in other things, and actuated by that fervent love towards it, which is so natural to a man who views in it the native soil of himself and his progenitors for several generations. I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize without alloy the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens the benign influence of good laws under a free government, the ever favorite object of my heart, and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. George Washington, 19th of September, 1796. So that is our Christmas gift to you, Washington's address. Look it up. Let's hold our nation accountable to what the founders intended that we should be, and let's hold our representatives accountable to that end. And if they don't comply, we should vote them out. That also requires doing something to reform our elections. But my sense is that if we can manage to avert the very real danger of a descent into hideous escalated war, that we are also at a breaking point where people are not going to tolerate this injustice anymore. But to actually be victorious, we have to be unified in the way that Washington spoke of. So guard yourself. Make sure that if you are feeling angry, that you have the right enemy, which usually is not your neighbor, but someone in a very small faction who has a lot of resources to manipulate the way people think. And with that, please go. I posted in the links below, the comments below, both on Facebook and YouTube, the Schiller Institute website, where you can find a leaflet to distribute at religious services or organizations or events throughout the holidays, demanding a Christmas truce and demanding that Biden, who nominally claims to be Catholic, actually accept the proposal of the current Pope to host such negotiations. The United States obviously would have to encourage this because, believe me, Zelensky does not do anything on his own. He is not his own person. He is owned by the parties that want this war, which one, unfortunately, is our government. And that's the fight that we have. So thank you all for listening. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas, and I will see you again in a week.